Welcome to State of Open subset from Open UK. My name's Lorna and I'm a board director at Open UK as well as an open source technology leader. I'm pleased to have you joining us for today's session. State of Open subset is a part of our annual conference, State of Open Con. We had a lot more talks than we had track space for, so we're pleased to share at least some of those talks with you in this series. Each subset episode will be also available on our website at openuk.uk/subset and on our YouTube channel. Our speakers will join us live and will be around after their talk to answer any questions that you have. So remember that although we're meeting digitally, all our sessions are subject to the Open UK Code of Respect, which you can find on the bottom of every page of our website. Feel free to share on social with the hashtags OpenUK and State of Open subset. So, our speaker today is Amanda Brock. Amanda is CEO of Open UK, the UK organisation for the business of open technology, and of course the organisation behind Subset. I work on Open UK with Amanda, but I started reading about her for this formal introduction, and honestly, if I tried to tell you everything that she has been appointed to or recognised for, we would not have time for the talk. To tell the story in just a few words, she is instrumental in the open source arena in the UK and works not only with Open UK, but also the OSI, the Cabinet Office, BCS, and others to represent open technology's interests. I'm very happy that she does, and that she's made the time to deliver her talk, Will Open Source Fail?, here in Subset. We will have time for questions after the talk, so stay with us for that, but this is enough from me. Amanda, please take the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO of Open UK, and it's really lovely to join you today for an edition of State of Open Subset. Beautiful sunny weather outside and a great time of year to be joining you digitally across the UK and beyond. Thank you very much for coming along today. Somewhat controversially, I guess, I'm going to talk to you about Will Open Source Fail? And I've only really started to give this talk with this title. It's obviously different every time I give it, but I've only really started to give it this year. And the first time I posted on social media that I was going to talk about this, a number of people commented, oh yeah, that the answer to that is going to be no, it's clickbait. But actually it's not. So let's see what the answer to it is. For anybody who doesn't know me, my history, my journey with open source began 15 years ago, almost exactly, February 2008, when I joined an open source company called Canonical, the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. And I worked there for 5 years. I was a lawyer for 25 years, and I ran the legal team at Canonical. And then I shifted and I worked for a couple of years in a law firm and in a number of different tech organizations. And over the last few years, as well as my role, at Open UK, I've been CEO for 3.5 years now. I have done a number of other community projects. And like most people in open source, I give my time freely over and above my day job. And I have a number of roles, and I've had a number of roles, including being the chair of an advisory group for the United Nations Technology Innovation Labs. I'm currently government appointed on a Cabinet Office board on the Open Standards board. And last year I stood for election, which I have to say was quite nerve-wracking. It's the first time in my life I've stood for an election. It may well be the last. And I stood as a board director of the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative is the guardian of the open source definition. Very important organisation in my view. So it's a great honour to be part of the board there. And last year, for my sins in many ways, I was the editor of a book that was published in October called Open Source Law, Policy and Practice. And that book is actually one that had 26 authors, many of them world-leading experts. This is a card at All Things Open last year where we launched the book. And you can see that we had 6 of the female authors, 26 authors, 24 chapters, me as the editor. And I'm just looking to see, there isn't a link there. I actually went viral on the Chinese internet, and as a result of that we now also have a Chinese publisher who's been doing a translation to Mandarin, which will be available around October-November 2023. And I spend a lot of my life traveling the world and sitting in my kitchen talking to my cat and all of you about open source software. So Open UK, I think we're probably one of the most high profile country organizations in open source software, but we're not just about open source software. We're about open technology. And you'll see here our purpose, which was set in July 21. We're actually looking at a refresh of our vision, mission, purpose in the next few weeks. And our purpose is to develop UK leadership and global collaboration in open technology. And in 21, we took that step forward from our initial purpose of developing UK leadership, which we set in 2020. And that's really important to us because it sets the scene for who we are. You know, we focus locally in our activities to collaborate globally. And we followed a model that is truly open source. So there are 2 of us who are employed to work in the organisation. There are a number of people who come and help us on a contract basis. But the majority of the people who run the organisation, who lead the organisation, are pro bono. And if you're listening to me today or you've seen me at anything else and you want to talk about being part of Open UK, the ambassador role is a very light touch one. It's about us promoting you and you promoting us and coming to events with us and engaging with your peers. And it's a really great networking space. But it's not so full on. Our apprentice ambassadors are being mentored by our ambassadors. We've got a few more of them just onboarding right now. And our international ambassadors. We also then work through a number of different groups like the legal working group, which is mainly lawyers, our awards committee, our learning committee, museums, security advisory board, policy advisory board, sustainability advisory board, all of which are active and advising us currently. And we're now accepting applications on AI and quantum advisory boards. And what I was saying there is if you're interested in any of this, do come and speak to me because there is an email admin at openuk.uk, which is the way to always contact OpenUK. So that was admin at openuk.uk. But do come and speak to me because we're always looking at people joining us in different roles. And we can sometimes build roles around someone's skills. You know, we don't have to look at traditional roles. We can find something new. A lot of the people who have worked with us have used their Open UK experience as a way to build their skills, maybe do a role that's a step above what their title is in their own job now, so that it helps them move their career forward. And we like to think that we build this sense of belonging in everything we do and that it's at the heart of everything Open UK does. So we think about DEI and we think about sustainability, not as separate topics, but at the heart of Open UK's work. And you can see that in our engagement with our audience. We held our first annual conference in February. 88.3% of the people who signed up came along. And you'll see that the gender and ethnicity is broader than you would normally expect to see in open technology and open source software. We had 43% of our speakers were non-binary or female, and about a quarter of our speakers were not white. But then when you look at our delegates, we carry that mix of women through. Women and non-binary delegates were almost a third of our delegates. But when we look at ethnicity, there was an impressive 50-50 split between white delegates and non-white. And that's something that I don't think I at least have ever seen or heard of in any other tech event. And it's something that's really important to me in Open UK. And we want to build this organisation of the future which will have a diverse workforce. And what we do is we focus not on companies, although we are very grateful to all of these companies for sponsoring us. And there are many that sponsor us generally and make sure we have the money that allows our organisation to thrive. But then others who sponsor specific activities or who perhaps give us their support in kind through use of offices, that kind of thing, or even some of their services. And we want to focus on individuals because we want to build a cohesive community. And we focus on the leadership that the UK has across open technology, not just software, but software, hardware, data. And we bring them together through a series of different events, through awards where we can recognise their skills and talents. This is last year. I missed it because I had COVID and everybody else had this amazing party at the House of Lords. And then our honours list. And we've had 3 honours lists. The third was at the beginning of 2023. Very British thing, like the Queen's honours list, now the King's honours list. We have an Open UK honours list. And we will be celebrating the 300 or so people who have received honours from us with a party at the Digital Catapult on the 14th of June. So we're really looking forward to that. We also are now running a series of meetups across the country to bring people together, not just in London. Sometimes I feel we're a little bit London focused. That's generally because it's easier for everybody to get to that one place when we do things that require people to move across the country. But we are increasingly trying to make sure that we're out in the different regions across the UK. And by bringing that community together and creating a bond amongst them, we create a very strong grouping who can use their collective voice. And that collective voice is powerful. That's one of the beauties of open source, is the power of the collective. And we use that to influence law and policy. And we do it through things like responding to legislation. We don't just do that in the UK. We've done that in the US with the SBOM requirement that came out of the executive order in May 21. And we joined an amicus brief in the Google Oracle litigation back in 2020. In 2021, we started to do our annual reporting. Our survey is currently live for 2023. Really appreciate everybody completing that survey this year. If you're based in the UK, it makes a huge difference to us. The more people who can complete it, the better. And I'll stick that now in the chat. But please do complete a survey. And the survey information goes into our digital information, our economic information rather, and our other cutting of data to create reports that really show what the UK is doing. And we have data about the UK that no other country in the world has got. In 2022, we were able to show 5 times the amount of investment made by the government in the Levelling Up Fund was being made in companies in the UK into open source software. In 2021, we showed 20% of the digital economy is based on open source software. In reality, I think it's much more, but that's what we were able to show. And I suspect we'll be able to show much more this year. So I'm looking forward to getting you participating in the survey and getting the data from you so that we can share some real insight back to you. In September, we have our second Open Technology for Sustainability Day. The first one was at COP26, and that will be in Edinburgh on the 14th of September. It's free to attend, and we will be focusing on a number of different things. On Friday the 26th, we finalised the content. We're just waiting for a few speakers to get that over the line. And by the time you hear this presentation, you should be able to go online and see the full agenda for the day. And that will include our carbon negative data centre model and our EV charging model, reducing carbon emissions significantly by the use of open technology, open source software, hardware, data. And we also do a range of activities in this policy space, not just sustainability. We focused on security last summer. We'll be doing it again through July and August, and we will have our second summer of open source software security. You try saying that. And last year it was recognised as one of 8 notable initiatives. So our policy work is very recognised and very important to us. And we can only do that because we have a community that gives us the ability to have influence through their scale and through their power of leadership. And then if you look at our logo, you'll see 3 dots, and they're meant to represent software, hardware, data. There are 3 blocks in our circle. The first is meant to represent our community, the second, legal and policy, and the third, learning and skills development. And we need to build on the skills of the future to allow the future leadership community to come together. So it's a virtuous circle. And we've done this initially through a kids camp in 2020 and 2021. We did a camp each summer, and we were very fortunate to have been runners-up in the GNOME Community Challenge. That was a great honour. So what we have done there is we've just found out that the Microbit Foundation, whose microbits were used in our kids camp, are giving those across schools in the UK. So we're polishing up our courses to reissue them for 2024, which is really exciting to see something like that being repurposed and reused. Our training doesn't just focus on kids. We have done adult training. We do it through various talks. We did Future Leader Talks, which are on YouTube through lockdown. There's about 60 of those. And Future Founders is something run by our entrepreneur in residence, Matt Barker, and a founders forum. And the Future Founders training did 8 sessions last spring, which are being repurposed into academic material at the University of Strathclyde. And their entrepreneurship school is going to produce a MOOC, a massive open online course, Open UK's massive open online course in the business of open technology. So I very much hope that you will take part in that. And you can see, the MUVs and across our social media, just some of our stats from last year. how much impact a tiny organization like Open UK can have. And that's really the voice, the collective voice that we bring together. Now, we culminated our year last year with our financial year runs to the end of February. So in February with State of OpenCon, and we were honoured to be part of the FOSDEM Fringe. It's really great to be able to associate with FOSDEM. And we had our conference that we've talked about and which we'll be running again next year. And we had 134 speakers over 7 tracks. It was just incredible. You know, the participation, the engagement, the quality of the conference. So if anybody's interested in getting involved, we will be looking for volunteers and staff to help with the conference as we see State of OpenCon 24 starting to appear across your screens in the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks. So all of this for me is about open source software. My background is open source software. I run an organization that focuses on software, hardware, data, but my deep personal knowledge and my experience comes primarily from open source software. So what is it? Well, unfortunately, there is no trademark in it. So sometimes it's something that is up for debate, but in short, it is generally accepted as a legal definition that open source software is software where the source code is freely made available and which meets the open source definition. Sometimes people include the free software, the 4 freedoms and things, but it tends to confuse and one captures the other anyway. So I like to use a definition, which is that open source software is software where the source code, the human readable source code, is shared and made freely available under an open source initiative approved license. And an open source initiative approved license meets the open source definition. Sometimes when I'm in rooms of engineers or people around open source, I joke we should recite this together. And the reality is nobody can do it. It's something that isn't nearly well enough known. But the things that I'm most interested in are 5 and 6, at least for today. No discrimination against persons or groups, which means that anybody, anywhere in the world, at any time, can use your software once you've open sourced it. You can't take it back, but anybody can use it. And no discrimination against fields of endeavour. So not only can anybody use it, they can use it how they want for whatever they want, whether you like it or not, once you release it open source. And it's really important to understand that. And one thing all of these licenses have, and this is, I've got 2 or 3 different sample licenses here to give you a taste of it, all OSI approved, open source definition compliant licenses. One thing they all have is this disclaimer of warranty and limitation of liability. So when open source is created, it's often created by community individuals who become maintainers of the code they've created, and they give you their code generally free of charge. Now, the licenses will allow them to charge, but nobody does. So you get this code without payment, and the license, the right to use the code, the right to use the copyright in the code that flows with it says there is no warranty and there is no liability to the extent that that's allowed from a legal perspective. And that's really important to understand, because that's the place from which open source develops, that it's something that's shared with the world for no particular purpose, that anybody can take it and use it, and that there is no liability, and that the originator, the creator of the code, specifically disclaims the liability. Now, you'll see more later why that all matters. We've seen a massive shift. When I joined Canonical 15 years ago, it was really difficult to get people to adopt open source software in the enterprise. And we've seen a massive shift where today someone like Jim Zemlin, the executive director at Linux Foundation, will stand up and tell you that open source software is the majority of software created today. And we've seen this massive shift because what we've seen is a trajectory towards open source due to digitalization and a number of other things. So digitalization has meant that every organization in the world, whether it is a company that uses software or technology to build its product, distribute its product, or have it consumed, and its products and services, will find that they are now software defined. And in 2023, if they're software defined, it means they're open source. Everything relies on open source software today. At the same time, we see the role of the developer elevated because they become more important because they're working in these digital organizations that need software developers, and they're able to use Git-based tools. And Git's a tool, it's not a language, it's a tool which we've seen the rise of GitHub, GitLab, and other repositories that allow dispersed, collaborative, shared working to be done. And it also allows a space for open source developers to share their code. somewhere that it can be made freely available to the world, and somewhere that those developers with their elevated status are able to dip in and out of. So they can go into one of those repos, grab some code, take it into their organization and kick the tires. Now, when I was at Canonical, we were blocked by legal, by procurement, by finance, who had to approve the inbound code. Now that that code is very freely available, unless you have policies that prohibit it, there is no need for a contract because it's on that standard open source license that I've just explained to you. Smart companies understand that there's a shift in risk, a shift away from contracting to policy and procedures around open source. And that policy and those procedures are part of the good curation, the good management of open source software that I'll talk to you about in a minute. So I've already talked to you about the elevated status of developers. I've talked to you about the digital economy and the digitalization and the use of Git causing this increase in open source software. But of course, cloud. The fact that we now have this digital infrastructure where internet and cloud computing are largely based on open source software has really seen a shift in adoption. And when we think about that, 10, 15 years ago, when I was in Canonical, we were running an open source operating system. We were trying to get it to be more significant on the desktop. And our competitor was Microsoft. Steve Ballmer, the founder of Microsoft, described open source as a cancer. 10 years later, 2018, fast forward to Open Source Summit Edinburgh. My friend Steve Wally is on the stage here keynoting Open Source Summit. And he is in front of this backdrop with Satya Nadella saying, judge us by the actions we've taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future, i.e. we don't think open source is a cancer anymore. And that journey that Microsoft has taken, that's something that Steve talked about, and he puts it down to three things. Firstly, anybody who's learned to code in the last 20 years uses open source methodology, open source practices. Secondly, customers are specifically asking for innovation that is open source because the best innovation is coming out of that space and out of collaboration. So there is often code that they can't get an equivalent to that's proprietary. And third, as Steve put it, cloud. You run a business like Azure, you can't just use open source software. You also have to be able to contribute back because that's how you have influence. That's how you manage to have things like feature development done for you. So your engineers have to be part of those communities, and you have to be, as someone who's a big user, seen as a big contributor. Small user, small contributor, fair enough. Big user, big contributor, absolutely necessary if you want to stay engaged and have those relationships. And we're seeing that adoption, and this journey is something that's happening across the board. Recently this year, MWC, we see it across the telco sector. Somewhat controversially in some instances, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes. And it's not just enterprise. We've also seen it across the public sector. Back in 2010-11, I was on a Cabinet Office Advisory Board where the government in the UK shifted to the world's first, I believe, open source software policy, where they required open source software first. Europe is talking about a digital decade. I think the last decade was really the digital decade, and that we're now in the open source decade. But, it's all going in the right direction. And as I was reading about that digital decade, I had no idea that a few months later we were going to see the pandemic. And of course, that was a great environment for open source. We saw almost every test and trace app. I'm not saying that the UK's was the best one, or track and trace app as they were initially called, being open sourced. We see the health services not just using it for apps, but for their infrastructure. And we see it not just in healthcare, but we see it across the energy sector too, where the UK's energy sector called for a spine of open source software to be built across the UK. So open source is one. No, it's not going to fail. Shall we go home? Well, life just isn't that simple. And you may have picked up on the fact that I said what we've seen is unprecedented adoption at a scale that nobody could have imagined. And what we've not seen is learning to match it. So what we still see today is FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt. And FUD is something that has travelled with open source as long as its history. And it's largely because when open source is adopted in a sector, in a market, it disrupts. And when something disrupts, it disturbs existing status and existing business models. And that disruption means that many companies push back. They don't want to lose their revenue model. And why would they? You know, if it's hundreds of thousands, millions, or even billions of dollars a year in revenue, why would they want to risk losing it? And one easy way for them to fight back, because open source is something that's relatively new to many people, is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we've seen that even amongst companies who have, to some extent, used that new model as a marketing technique. And we've seen doubling down on open when actually Elastic, whose founder put this blog post out, was doing quite the opposite and moving away from open source, causing confusion as to what open source meant. And we're seeing this again even last summer. So this is not a problem that's gone away. We see an issue in the telco sector and slightly beyond that, because standards don't just apply to telcos, but it's very obvious in the telco sector because it's one of the sectors that's most dependent on standards. And it's dependent on standards where each standard tends to have standard essential patents, and those patents generate royalties. They're generated on a FRAND, a fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory basis, which means everybody pays the same. However, it means everybody pays. And it doesn't flow well with the ecosystem of open source software. So this piece, the report that was produced for the European Commission by Mirko Bohm and Knut Blind at Fraunhofer was then updated in my book. And you might be interested, I think it's chapter 11 or 12, in their chapter on standards, which absolutely clarifies that open source software and standards are not happy bedfellows. FRAND, despite the fact that it's fair and reasonable, requires a flow of royalty revenue that just doesn't work for open source. And we're seeing a lot of FUD. This 4IP Council group and this table of licenses is completely incorrect. And it's doing stuff to create miscommunication. It's making the tech press, and they're naming names there around things going wrong with open source and standards. That they're basically spreading FUD, trying to confuse people. So what we need to fix that are open standards, and we need more where we don't have open standards. So I would say open standards is the default. But if for any good reason we don't have open standards, the patents that are used within these standards need to be part of a defensive patent pool like Open Invention Network. And Open Invention Networks works on a basis where anyone can join. There is no negotiation of the license terms, which means that from an antitrust and competition perspective, it's well managed and it doesn't allow for any breaches. And anybody can join, and if they join, they are committing to share their patents, to give a license to everybody else within the group. Nobody has paid anything to be part of the group, to use those patents free of charge and not to be sued for that usage. And we've seen this model applied in the Rockstar Consortium about 10 years ago, where the Department of Justice investigated the transfer of the Nortel patents, and their output was that the patent should be encumbered or should carry a license for defensive usage on an OIN license. And all of this comes back to the start of a digital decade, right? Because every country in the world is thinking about how they manage their digitalization, how they balance their local citizens' needs and rights and privacy against the ability of companies in a digital environment and a global digital world to make money. And this, I often quote this, it's the appointment of Marguerite Vestager, the Competition Commissioner and Digital Director or VP Digital for Europe, by Ursula von der Leyen in 2019. And in this, you can read it and swap the words Europe for UK or America or British and American or Chinese or Indian or any country. And what we're seeing is changes in digital technology and geopolitics having a profound effect on the lives of people. Witnessing major shifts all the way from global power structures to local politics. And what we do now will affect and determine what kind of world our children live in, wherever in the world they're from. And this is about creating not just a Europe, but a world fit for a digital future. And that's the concerns of politicians. They want to see that their country is well looked after. Back at the beginning of 2020, we were at FOSDEM, the last conference before lockdown. And we were actually, a bunch of us are outside the Commission. This is me with some Open UK folks. We were outside the Commission at midnight when the the lights went off and we Brexited. And that probably was the first and most significant and obvious geopolitical shift, because you can take it to a moment in time which you can rarely do, a single second when the UK left. And we see a whole load of stuff going on across Europe with the European Court of Justice and Schrems and its defensive approach to China. So Europe is really seeing geopolitical shift with the UK, with China, with the US and Schrems saying that the US is not an adequate place to be sending data to without further provisions. And we also see the US having a breakdown in relationships with China, and even the UK ordering the strip out of Huawei equipment from the mobile sector. And I think probably the most recent very sad geopolitical shift that we've all seen is the war in Ukraine. And one of the things that we see with geopolitical shift is friction. And what open source does is remove friction by allowing anybody to use open source software for any purpose. But of course, we've seen this kind of pushback on open source with protestware, where there are various tools used to stop the open source being used by particular peoples, in this case in Russia. And that's not what open source software is all about, because it's for anybody for any purpose, and this undermines open source. So geopolitical shift creates FUD, it creates confusion, and has a real impact. And you can see that that geopolitical shift matters from an open source perspective and vice versa, something that not many people would have thought of until the last few years. We see pieces like this, which I think were very unhelpful, at least the headline being written by organisations engaging for the first time with open source. And this is from somebody who works at Atlantic Council, and was written because they are looking at the infrastructure, because today open source and software form the basis of our digital infrastructure. We live in a digital world where services that governments provided via bricks and mortar are now being provided digitally. And we see government more concerned today about bad actors in the security space, the cybersecurity space, than at any time in history. And we've seen this across the US. Things like Log4j haven't helped. We've got an industry response through OpenSSF. But then again, in this year, a new update from the White House, who are now consulting with business to try and ensure that they have, possibly through insurance, some sort of liability around software generally. And that liability looks like it's going to follow commercialization. So where money changes hands, software providers will be responsible. Now, of course, with open source software, money does change hands, but it changes hands for services. And it's very important as you structure your contracts that the open source software is distributed on an open source license, one of those standard OSI approved licenses, and not on the contract terms that you are distributing any proprietary software on. So open source potentially will not be caught at all by this, even if it's commercialized. We see Europe messing up with the Cyber Resilience Act. A new version of the Act is, privately in circulation amongst many people at the moment. I won't dwell on this, but they really have got it wrong. And the rest of the open source community have made them very aware they've got it wrong. They, in Recital 10, talk about commercial open source, completely wrong. And they then look at adding product liability into open source, which just won't work, but it comes with very large fines. And we've seen in the UK quite a sensible approach so far with a call for views, which closed on the 1st of May and recognises the need for international collaboration. So we're hoping that this will take us forwards on an international basis in a joined up way. So still, open source is one, but is it sustainable? Well, what we're seeing is an environment where open source has key and critical adoption, but is really under threat and really under challenge. And what we see is the mass adoption at scale not being followed, as I said earlier in this presentation, not being followed by an understanding of open source and a learning and the ability to manage it well. And that management of open source has become known as curation. To me, the definition of curation is the good technical hygiene and good governance of open source software. The practices that you need to use to put it in place well and maintain and manage it through its life cycle in order that you have safe and secure software in your digital infrastructure. And that's something Eric Brewer wrote about in our report last year. And I think you'll see an awful lot more about. Personally, I would argue that there is a new business model for open source software, and that business model may not really be a business model, but an approach. And I think it's time that we saw open source software being recognized as a digital public good, and where we saw government investing in a joined up collaborative way across the globe to return value to the maintainers, to ensure that maintainers have two things: that they are rewarded for their work, but also that they have resource that's very necessary to ensure that software is well maintained. And that resourcing also requires money. It requires skills development, the kind of things that I was talking to you about early on that's critical to open source and Open UK's work. And we need to do more work collectively to understand and to research open source and to demonstrate its value. And that's some of the work we're doing in our survey. So again, I'll remind you to take our survey. But understanding the value generated, not just the cost of building it, will really allow us to show how much of our digital economy relies on that. And I mentioned earlier, this is our 2020, 43.15 billion was the estimate we had based on the Commission's calculations. We refined that a bit and we got a 46.5 billion estimated value to the UK GDP from open source software in our digital economy. So has open source won? Will it fail? Well, I think we've won a battle. I think we're on a journey, and I believe that it could fail, sadly, if we don't ensure that we educate people and manage their understanding of open source software, their processes, their practices, the curation of open source software in an appropriate way. But I think that if we all as a community work together in ensuring that learning happens and ensuring these practices are embedded into our society, then effectively what we'll do is we'll give back control to people and create a digital future that is very different. However, there is a moment in time that we're all living through where I would say we're on a teeter-totter, the balancing point of a seesaw. Will open source fail? Maybe. Will open source succeed? Maybe. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and your patience today. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If you think you have a talk that would be a good fit with Subset or State of OpenCon, let us know. We will open the call for papers for State of OpenCon later this summer. But if you want to speak in the Subset series, drop us a note. We're at admin@openuk.uk. Send us your biography, your talk idea, and why you think it's a great fit. You can sign up to the Open UK newsletter. There's a link at the top of every page of our website. We would love you to hear more about what we're doing and to come along, maybe one of our meetups or one of our digital activities. Thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you at the next Subset episode.